Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to talk about early scholasticism. We'll talk about Anselm, Abelard, and Lombard. And here we have pictures of them. We've got Anselm on the leftmost side, Abelard in the middle, and Lombard on the right side. It should be a pretty exciting talk. Now, one thing I will say is if you are part of my Philosophy 303 class, or if you've been kind of following this series of medieval philosophy videos, the format of this one's going to be a little bit different from the other videos that I put out. It's going to be shorter, and it's going to be more of a general overview. And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, truthfully, I've got the class starting soon that I'll be teaching, and I'm just running out of time, right? We'll obviously, if you're one of my students, we'll cover these things in more detail during the lectures. But as of right now, I'm just running short on time, so I need to, get something out there, and hopefully, for later editions of the class, I'll be able to really update it and make changes as necessary. These are the things we're going to talk about. Our Anselm section is going to be a little bit more detailed because some of the things that he talks about in his ontological argument are a bit more dense, so it just takes a little bit more time to explain. And if you were in my Philosophy 101 class, you'll actually probably remember some of this, because this is something I've covered before, but it's such an interesting topic that it is worthwhile to go over it again, because a lot of times we don't really truly come to understand something until we've been over it 2 or 3 times, right? So we also will talk a little bit about St. Bernard of Clairvaux. He is kind of a foil to Abelard, right? So we'll see a little bit more about that, but he's not mentioned so much in the title because it's not necessarily about him, just kind of showing more about Abelard and his role in history. Scholasticism was a formalized methodology as well as like a teaching methodology in a time period in philosophy, right? Prior to the rise of scholasticism, there weren't really strong teaching methods. A lot of it was still based on, the private tutor system that we saw in the Roman Empire. So around this time, we start seeing dedicated textbooks, and we start seeing a more dialectical method, partly based on the Socratic method, partly based on Aristotle, right? We got students doing research, we got students studying, and it really becomes the foundation of the modern university, right? So what we understand as an education has its roots in scholasticism. Abelard and Lombard, as we see their work Sic Non and the Sentences, are two of the things that really help get this system going, right? People would go to school and they would study the writings of Abelard, or they'd study the writings of Lombard, do dissertations on them, do studies on them, and that was how you prove that you had come to understand the doctrine. And then when we get a little later, we see the Summa Theologica back here on my bookshelf, right, by Aquinas. That becomes one of the things that they study, right? So we see this strong emphasis on formalized study, on structure, and we see sort of like a uniformity starting to come, right? We're starting to get a little bit of bureaucracy and formalization. The scholastic programs were strongly Christian in nature, and they did focus on things like logic, language, and metaphysics. We got to remember this is prior to the invention of the scientific method, so they will learn about things like science, but they're doing it from an Aristotelian basis, which is mostly just based on observation and then reasoning, right? We haven't really reached the point in time where active experimentation has been formalized. So we get first to St. Anselm of Canterbury. He was a Benedictine monk who wrote a lot about religion and philosophy, and his most famous work is the Proslogium. And in it, he makes this argument for the existence of God that has been talked about for basically the last 1,000 years. I mean, we're talking about it right now. And the argument goes something like this. Therefore, if that which nothing greater can be conceived exist in the understanding alone, in our mind, the very being which nothing greater can be conceived is one which a greater can be conceived, right? So we think about this thing where there's nothing better that we can think about in our mind. And if we can think that, then there is something that is greater that can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible, but hence there is no doubt there exists a being which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in understanding and reality, right? So in our understanding, we've got this whole little world where we kind of instantiate and put together ideas, and then in reality there's this world where we get our ideas, right? And we're going to see a little bit more of that. So Anselm's a bit of a Neoplatonist, and within God exists these different things, and they're the most real things. We've got goodness, we got love, we got existence, right? So within God exist all these things, and it instantiates down into an immortal soul and into a material world, and then finally into our ideas, right? And our ideas are coming from this higher source. They're connecting to us, right? Via instantiation, right? So there are these things that exist above us, and then they're coming down to us, and then we're getting them into our head. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we got to first kind of talk about understanding and conceiving. To understand is to think about existing ideas, right? I've got a pen here. I understand pens. I'm just thinking about the pen. It's black, it's silver. I know it can write. To conceive is to draw upon our knowledge and create, right? So I'm going to use the pen example. I've got this pen, and I can conceive of the pen having a laser pointer built into it, So I could imagine what that laser pointer attached to my pen would look like. Now, because God is the source of all creation, his existence is necessary for creation to exist, remember? So everything is kind of coming from God in this line down, right? This is a Platonist understanding of God, and throughout the Proslogium, Anselm describes God as compassionate to us, but passionless in himself, right? So God is just this force beyond our reckoning, and to us, his actions will seem loving or compassionate or vengeful or whatever, but we don't actually know because God is beyond those things, right? We saw a little bit of this with Pseudo-Dionysus. God is so far beyond our understanding that we put words to these things, but we don't actually understand, right? So in the material world which we live, we can only conceive of ideas which can be instantiated from existing ideas. So the idea has to exist at a higher place for us to understand it, right? So you have this idea in your head of a thing of which nothing greater can be conceived. If you can think of that idea in your head, it means that thing must actually exist, right? That thing must exist that in order for us to instantiate it, right? Since all instantiate ideas are from a higher, more perfect ideas drawn from God, if you can conceive of a greatest being, then a greatest being will have to exist, right? So if you can conceive it, then the greatest being necessarily must exist because there is this line of instantiation, right? So that's St. Anselm and his most famous argument. Now, he did write and talk about a lot of other stuff, but, that's kind of where we're going to cut off from here. Next, we've got Peter Abelard. Abelard was an intellectual titan of his time, and he did a lot of stuff. His most famous work is Sic et Non, the textbook. And he argued for a type of nominalism / conceptualism, right? Which says that universals are objects of the mind, right? They're rooted in human prediction. They're not things that exist somewhere. So this is completely different from Anselm, right? Like where we think back to like love or goodness or justice, right? Abelard's saying that it just exists in our mind. It's not just like actually floating up there as part of God or something. He says that our kind of universal understanding of these things is just almost a function of the way our minds work, right? Our rational minds function a certain way so all humans are going to kind of come to similar conclusions about things. Interestingly, he also argued that morality came from intentions and that people ought to try and live by the golden rule. And in many ways, this seems a lot like Immanuel Kant, right? So if you remember your Philosophy 200 course, that's the kind of thing Kant was saying. And it does make me wonder if part of Kant's earlier study in life focused on Abelard and sic et non. I mean, I would be surprised if it didn't, but it is definitely an interesting kind of coincidence. And then finally, with Abelard, he was very famously castrated after an affair with Heloise d'Argenteuil. I know I didn't say that right, but I tell you, what a tough way to go. That the most famous thing about you, at least in modern times, is that you were castrated for, a love affair with somebody. I mean, that's a rough way to go. And we get to someone who kind of will show the character of Abelard. We got Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was seen as a later church father. He helped co-found the Knights Templar, and he instituted Benedictine reforms via the Order of the Cistercians. And basically what he felt is that the Benedictines had moved too far from the work of St. Benedict via the rule of St. Benedict, and he was trying to get back to that more rigid, structured monastic lifestyle. He argued for more of a plain language understanding of Scripture. That is, to kind of move away from many of these more Platonist ideas to look to, just more of a regular understanding of how we understand the Scripture and God's place in the world. He also argued for the place of Mary in Christianity. There was debates about what Mary's role should be within worship and within the church, and he very strongly argued for that. He was involved in the two popes schism, in which there were two competing popes elected at one time. And he also very famously disputed with Abelard on the Trinity. Abelard had, according to Bernard of Clairvaux, written some things that were heretical. So Abelard petitioned him and then had him debate in front of a council. Bernard of Clairvaux ended up winning the debate, and kind of showing that Abelard had some misunderstandings of Christian doctrine, right? So what we see with Abelard via his confrontation with Bernard of Clairvaux is that he was someone who was getting into trouble, right? He's gotten castrated. He's, debating on the Trinity. Like, he's not having a good time. He's having a rough go of it. Then finally, we'll talk just a little bit about Peter Lombard. He really put together a very important book when it comes to the study of philosophy of religion and Christianity and metaphysics and all that. And it was the 4 books of the Sentences. And for hundreds of years, it basically served as a study guide, right? And he talks about all these things. I've got them listed here: the Trinity, the fall of man, angels, the incarnation of Christ, sacraments, heaven and hell, virtue. He talks about virtue in one of them. And that is impactful at the time, right? Because prior to Lombard, a lot of these things hadn't really been collated together in like a larger set. So it's thanks to Lombard that a lot of these things really start to get categorized and collated together. So the Scholastic Age really allowed for the development of modern universities. Many advances were made in logic, metaphysics, language, and ethics, right? And those are things that we kind of take for granted today, but they were things that no one really understood back then, right? We get nominalism, we get advancements in ethics as far as like intention and virtue, we get strong advancements in logic and mathematics, things that just would not have happened if it were not for the medieval age. Although there are a lot of people today that think faith and religion are opposed to each other, we can see from the time of the medieval philosophers that faith can be a guidepost to help make advancements. I do wonder how things might have been different if the scientific method had existed in the medieval period. What kind of advancements would we have seen coming out of these medieval universities? I think things would have really changed in a way that we could not imagine, right? But it's really an overlooked time period in the history of philosophy. People still refer to it as the Dark Ages, and if you've read very many philosophy textbooks, you'll see many of them just completely overlook this time period. And I think that's a bit of a detriment because a lot of stuff happened, a lot of our understanding of the world evolved because of that, and I think it's an area that definitely is worthy of more study and consideration. So thank you all for your time. Like I said, I know this is a lot shorter. I know it's not as detailed as a lot of my other videos, and I do apologize for that. Like I said, I hope in the future I can make much more detailed and time-consuming lecture videos, but I'm just running out of time right now, so I just want to make sure that I get some of this information out to you. And if you're one of my students, that you can take the time to really study it in more detail and hopefully get something really valuable out of it. So thank you so much. You have a great day.